Welcome to DRGLT Economics. In this podcast, I'll discuss the West's Cultural Revolution, its symptoms and background, and what lays ahead. Some of you may think that this could be a facetious topic, but I think that there are clear signs of an early stages, or at least a precursor of a form of cultural revolution that can be rather disruptive. So that's why I want to cover it in this podcast. I want to divide today's podcast into, let's say, 4+1 sections, but of course I want to cover them quickly. In the beginning, let's call it section 0. I want to just give some backgrounds for just in a couple of minutes. What was Cultural Revolution in China? And then moving on to the first section, I will discuss the symptoms of that can perhaps forebode some sort of cultural revolution moment. Then I move on to talk about the backgrounds. What are the circumstances against which the West could experience this cultural revolution? And then, of course, I will discuss in the third section if this were to happen, what could lay ahead. And finally, I want to discuss what people can do, the public, the society can do as a whole to prevent it. So first, let's just use a couple of minutes to talk about what was Cultural Revolution. Of course, you can find a lot of information on the internet, and of course, you can also find it from more trustworthy sources. So all I want to say is that from my personal understanding, the Cultural Revolution was really a power struggle, right? But it was motivated by an ideology. And the specific ideology that was being pushed was about class struggle and the pretend fact, or perhaps it was sort of fact, that there were infiltrators who were left behind by the nationalists, or perhaps by the Americans, let's say, by the imperialists, and it was necessary to weed out these infiltrators from key positions in the society. Okay, that was, I think, the background. But of course, in my judgment, the most important aspect, the motivation to launch this cultural revolution was in fact power struggle at the top. And I think even though that was the case, the fact that there were it was motivated by let's say counterintelligence, right, to weed out the infiltrators, actually had some background. If we look at Operation, I think it's called Operation Gladius, that was what happened in Europe. You can, of course, search for more information on Operation Gladius. I'm not an expert on that. I think there were similar things that actually took place in China. So there was some background. There was some element of truth in it. And this also, of course, is unsurprising, because in every lie there is a slither of truth. I don't know who said this, but that I think is quite true. Anyway, that was the background of what Cultural Revolution was. Let's move on to the first section, which covers the symptoms. What are some of the symptoms? I think it became most evident since 2016. This can be seen, identified, I think, by the word TDS, right? By Russian misinformation, and by Wokeism. TDS, I think, I don't want to talk too much because I think a lot of the English platforms are quite, sensitive about this topic. But generally, it is about a movement. My understanding is that it's a social movement encouraged or perhaps incentivized by or pushed by a group of people at the top of American power, or perhaps also in the West in general, because some of the key players in propping up this TDS have been European and in particular British in origin. What they wanted to do is to disrupt the agenda of an elected president and to ensure that policies that favor them will be implemented. And in the process, they also want to ensure that aberrations such as the thing that happened in November of 2016 did not happen again. And of course, in the same period, perhaps intentionally, perhaps unintentionally, there was also a growing demonization of the Russian Federation. I say involuntarily because that was necessitated by the need to push for TDS. By the same time, it was also voluntary because the choice of the Russian Federation, why it is called Russian misinformation, not, say, Egyptian misinformation or French misinformation. I think that it's because against the Russians in the West, there is a subtle, perhaps not, what is that word? But anyway, it's just a hidden wave of resentment, of hatred against the Russian people. For whatever reason, there are historic reasons for some parts of Europe. And then there are also reasons from McCarthyism and the Cold War mentality from other parts of Europe and in North America. And then, of course, there was some remnants of the radical movement from the 1930s in Europe that moved to North America. And then that's also, those groups have also a inherent hatred of the Russians because it was the Russians that defeated them. That was part of that. And then we also saw there was the demonization of not just Russians, but also the Chinese. And this points to something a bit different, right? This was because I think the Chinese were posing some sort of economic challenge to the Americans because they understand that that American power in relation to its competitors was waning, right? America remains extraordinarily strong, but it's no longer as strong when compared to the number two. And that is in itself an alarming moment. That requires some people to start demonizing the Chinese. And there are talks about, of course, the Russian disinformation story, Russian propaganda, everything and everyone who criticizes the West could be either a Russian agent or a Chinese agent. And of course, the Chinese always steals information, technology, intelligence from the West. and there are people who hold this thought. I'm not saying that this is correct, right? But there are people who think that every Chinese student in America is there to steal some information, and every Chinese woman in America is there to, set up a honey trap and get to compromise some of Americans' political leaders to gain leverage or to obtain intelligence. This so I said I talk about TDS, the demonization of Russia and China, and then there is also the fourth thing, or perhaps the third thing, which is Wokeism. Wokeism, in my judgment, is really just a new form of bullying. In the past, perhaps a few centuries ago, a couple of centuries ago, or perhaps even just a few decades ago, in North America in particular, it was perfectly acceptable to be a racist and misogynist. So it was perfectly possible for people who are considered white to abuse people who are not considered white, and it was perfectly acceptable for people who were male to demonize, to abuse verbally and sometimes also physically women. Right? That was the old times. Now times has changed, but people, the inclination for by some people to abuse others are left behind, and now it is people are abused because they're not woke enough. Right? There's always a competition on who is more woke. If you are not woke enough, for example, let's say if you drive a big car, then you're not woke enough, you can be abused. If you are not wearing, if you don't have a rainbow flag, then you're not woke enough, and you can be abused. And then, of course, if you talk about the fact that people have some physiological differences, then of course you are not woke enough and you are abused. So these are some of the symptoms, and I'm talking about these symptoms primarily because these are the fissures within the society, within Western society, primarily in American society, but I think because of America's exceptionally strong grip on European society, European culture, I think that there is a lot of these elements are communicable. So also they also apply to Europe, in particular Western Europe. And these ideas, these features, also provide the condition for a cultural revolution. Now let's move on to the second part of today's podcast, which is the background. I think to understand the background, it is an easy way to find Ray Dalio's recent video, and I'm recording this, I think, on the perhaps 10th of March. I think Ray Dalio posted his recent video on YouTube maybe just a week ago, and it was about the great cycle of rising powers and declining powers. And I think it is against this backdrop that we see the West's potential risks of a cultural revolution moment. Let me just cover very briefly what Ray Dalio mentioned in his video, and I think also in his book, about the decline, or perhaps the precursor of the decline of a major power, of a dominant power, and that is as the power reaches the top, it's the living style of the lifestyles of its people changes, and also the wages becomes high, and the cost of living becomes high, and That means that the society, the economy becomes less competitive. When there is a rising power that is, on the other hand, more competitive, then this dominant power, the incumbent, may spend a lot of money to reinforce its power, right? They may want to adventure militarily outside of its borders to maintain its hegemony. It may also borrow a lot of money because at that point, by virtue of being less competitive and spends a lot more, it becomes necessary in order to sustain the standard of living, the lifestyle, to borrow money.
And because the dominant power is issuing the world's reserve currency, it is possible to print money to an extent to maintain its power, its dominance. But at some point, when this is done too much, when the interests are so low, it's probably zero, when so much money is being printed and so much stimulus are being applied, the effects of monetary policy becomes less and less, but the appetite for more currency injection becomes higher and higher, more and more. And that means that at some point it becomes untenable. The situation becomes untenable. And at the same time, when money is being printed, inevitably there is going to be a widening gap in the society. That is also a gap of resentment, right? So the haves and have-nots will have different perspectives as regards to the way forward. The haves want to keep the status quo, whereas the have-nots want to change things. And this is when there are internal conflicts that can actually lead to really the precipitous downfall of a great power. Of course, this is not always the direct cause of the downfall of the dominant power. A lot of times it was external forces. In other words, it was because of military conflict with a rising power that after the loss of the dominant power costs the dominant power, the incumbent, its hegemony. But it could also be, and a lot of time I think it is, caused by an internal conflict which greatly weakens the incumbent. And I think one sentence that people should take away, at least I think from Ray Dalio's video, which is that a nation's greatest war is with itself. Now, if we link this with the symptoms, the fissures that I discussed, whether it's from TS or demonization of other countries, or it was Wokeism, all that means is that there is a lot of tension within the society. A lot of it is internal, and there are some valves that people want to open, right, to point to an external force, whether it's in the form of Russia or it's in the form of China. But whether that could work it's highly dubious. So now let's move to the third section of today's podcast, which is what could happen if things continue to move in this direction and we really have a cultural revolution in the West. Well, first, we will absolutely see, in that case, we will see more censorship. More censorship will be the first step. It will be the first step because, as many have said, And I quite concur with this statement, which is that certain groups of people, a select group of people at the top in the US, particularly residing in Washington, D.C. and Brussels, are constructing, and also in London, they are constructing an equivalent of what is called the Ministry of Truth. And what this structure, this instrument does is that it needs to, basically what it wants is to tell people what to think, what is right and what is wrong. And essentially, what they want you to know, what they want you to think is right. What they want you to think is wrong. That is counter to a rational or scientific or a objective point of view. Because an objective analysis, what is right should be considered right. What is wrong should be considered wrong. But here it's in reverse. What they tell you to think is right, they want you to think it's right. And in order to make sure that there is no one or no major voice in the society can opine against it, it is necessary to have mass censorship. And when we see mass censorship being rolled out, when we see mass deplatforming of important voices in societies, that means that they are setting up the ground for a cultural revolution. That's the first step. After a mass censorship, what they will do is to start character assassination. This will be targeted character assassination with the goal of seizing power. Right? They will say, for example, that this person is not qualified to lead because this person is a neo-Nazi. Perhaps this person is a racist, sexist, misogynist, or Russian agent, Chinese agent. And of course, this person needs to be constitutionally forbidden from running for office. Of course, that's just a single example, right? We need to understand that when cultural revolutions take place, the goal is to seize power, to get control of the society. And when the external forces, as I mentioned in the previous section, when there are external rising power that challenges the dominance of the incumbent power, the incumbent, in order to deal with it internally, some certain groups of people may need to seize power. They seize control of the power to make sure that they have control of the society, so that they are able to maintain the empire for as long as possible. So that's character assassination. And then, if they are successful, then we will have something that is more, let's say, tuned down version of cultural revolution. It will be relatively stable. I think the Western power, particularly the United States, will perhaps retreat a bit, carve out its own enclaves in the Americas and in Western and Central Europe. That will be its sphere of influence, and it will be content in continuing dominating half the world, not perhaps the entirety of the world, but half of the world. And it will continue, and perhaps over a period of time, if we have a very stable bipolar world, the Cultural Revolution can ease up. There will be a new generation of leaders in the West, and all these crazy talks, all these methods of leveraging the divide within the society will ease out, and maybe the society will prosper again. But if their attempts to do this character assassination are not very successful, that they do not seize power, absolute power of the Western political structure, they may result to something that is more violent. And then we can see some more internal controls, where we see secret police rounding up. For example, you have people who are supporting a certain group of certain policies, who are protesting, and then this poses a threat to the stability of those in power. They may want to send in the secret police, round up the protesters, maybe have some closed door trials, reissue some fines, imprison some of the protest leaders, and set some examples. Right, that could get a bit violent. That would be a form of what I would describe Iron Curtain, and there will be a more severe form of cultural revolution. In that context, I'm not entirely certain whether there will be a very stable bipolar world. It could be that even after a strategic retreat, the West would not be able to hold its own sphere of influence, particularly in Latin America, because people want freedom, and if they see that you have a divided society, you have a society that is both decadent and in decline, socially and economically, it is much more difficult for you to be a leader in any part of the world, and that could mean that there will be a further retreat from that part of the world, and eventually we will need to reach a point when there is either a new generation of leaders who think differently, or perhaps it would be a form of real revolution, not just cultural revolution, but a more conventional type of revolution. So that is the third section, where I discussed what if it really takes place. But in my judgment, there are some early signs, some precursors to a cultural revolution in the West. It is not inevitable. It is possible to avert it before it really becomes irreversible. I think it is important. Let me first say, just put it straightforward, not in order not to sound like someone who just provides a facetious ideas, right? Or ideas that are not serious. I think that it will not happen. I don't think the reforms that I talk about can take place. But there are some reforms at this point that can be taken. Right? We can, if in the West people get rid of at least all those unelected officials, the deep state, right? The likes of Ursula, the aristocrat, who is so aristocrat that it is necessary to have both fond and de in her name, and the likes of her, and of course the deep state in a lot of the Western countries. I don't really want to go into that. Get rid of these people, take power away from these people and give it back to the people. Make a small government, push for small government, more freedom, and lower taxes. Create an economic environment that is more competitive, so that you compete on the economic front, on productivity, with the agents, and of course with the Russians. And even if you don't become, you no longer will be as dominant as you had been in the last few decades, it is still possible to maintain a high level of prosperity and high level of standard of living. And in my judgment, for the interest, for the sake of the people, of the public of the West, this will be the ideal solution. A small government, no military adventurism, get rid of the deep state, lower taxes, higher productivity. But of course, deep states are not called deep states if they can just be gotten rid of because it is good for the interests of the public. As I say, I think some other people might have already said it, but I like to say that, these people got there not because they will do the right things because they're right, but because they do the wrong things because they're easy. And these are the people who will probably choose to do the wrong things. And that means more military adventurism. We have seen that took place in the last few decades in Central Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, generally Africa, across Africa, less so in Latin America, but of course more recently in Eastern Europe. And of course we can expect some more further military adventurism in Southeast Asia, in the West Pacific, and we're going to see a continued increase in military spending in the West, and that's in the context against the backdrop of record-setting inflation combined with record-setting money issuance is the exact recipe for the decline of an empire. But the empire will not just go easily into the night. It will probably have a cultural revolution first. And in this cultural revolution, I think the winners are not those in the West. All right, so that is today's podcast. I hope that I have presented some ideas that you find interesting. If so, please give me a like and share this video podcast if you can. Subscribe if you want as well. Thank you very much, and have a great day.